So this is the art of first-person animation. My name is David Helsby. I'm a senior animator at Bungie Studios, and I've been there for about 6 years. My game credits are at Bungie are Halo Reach and now Destiny and subsequent DLCs. And yeah. So I want to start out by asking you a question, and that is, what makes a Bungie game feel like a Bungie game? Well, a lot goes into creating the first-person experience, but first person is something that's going to affect how the game plays and feels on a moment-to-moment basis. And many of you may not even notice it if it's done right. So this talk is going to be split up into 3 parts. So first we're going to talk about supporting the goals of Sandbox design. Secondly, we're going to talk about making first-person content that feels good. And what does feels good mean, really? I'm going to talk about that later. And finally, I'm going to talk to you about how to keep from killing yourself in the process of making a game. And for all of you game developers out there, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. So what is first-person animation? Well, first-person animation is just the animation, it's the movement of your avatar from your perspective as a player, including the player camera. So all that motion you see, some designers have really told me that this is the most important animation in a first-person shooter, and whether you believe that or not, doing this content well is something that's definitely going to help the playability of the game, and more importantly, the replayability of your game. So let's get started. Supporting the goals of Sandbox design. Now, design and art don't always see eye to eye. Art wants to make like an amazing player attack that has like 3 seconds of anticipation, while design wants an attack that hits 1 frame after the player hits the button. Well, to build a new IP at Bungie, I really needed to know how to best support the goals of Sandbox design and build enough trust to try and push the artistic side of Destiny's first-person experience forward. So we came up with a set of design directives for first-person we called design pillars. So this is my first talk that I'm giving at GDC, and you know, when you're putting a talk like this together, you want to sound really prepared, and you want to sound like you know what you're doing, right? And so when in my first incarnation of this talk, I was going to say, yeah, you know, we made these design pillars, and we made them at the beginning of the project, and then we just followed that, and everything went super cool, right? And I gave this kind of this first talk to one of our Sandbox director, and he's like, what are you doing? He's like, tell the truth. And I was like, all right. So the truth is, we came up with these pillars of first-person design like after the project was finished. I sat down with it, and I'm like, what do we really do here? What's important? He's like, oh, okay, yeah, you know, we did this, and I'm like, all right, cool. Now, for the next game, we'll know. So here are our pillars. And you guys get them for free. You don't have to go through the pain we went through. So the first one is just immediate feedback from the player controller input. And that just means like you hit a button and you get an action. And if you think about it, your brain's already told you what you want to do. So if you hit the button and you don't get an immediate response, it feels wrong. It feels like there's a disconnect between you and the game. So like the minute that button gets pushed, you want to start seeing motion on the screen, like immediately. Secondly is the preservation of motion between actions. It just means everything has to flow smoothly from one motion to the other. And just we've gotten past the point where we can do a motion, it comes back to an idle and hits a wall, and then you do another motion. You need to be able to design animations that chain together effectively. So the third one is the player should have visceral satisfaction from your animation. Now this doesn't mean like, oh, make something cool, make a cool reload. This means think about each thing as a player experience. And that means like if I'm going to make like a really cool melee or reload, I need design and sound and effects all on board, because if we're all not working toward the same goal, toward the same player experience, it's not going to be as good as it could be. 4 is motion should serve to ground the player to the world. Now, first person is really an interactive experience, so or an immersive experience, so you should really feel like it should feel physical. There should feel like there's a body behind the camera. And finally, this is one that I thought was really interesting, and it didn't come on until very late. At least my true understanding of it, which is no speed bumps. And that just means we don't want to take control away from the player or slow them down in the sandbox as much as possible. And like an analogy of that is like you've got a really fast car. You've been given like a Ferrari. The last thing you want to do is go over a speed bump. You want to be on a straightaway. That car is meant to be driven fast, so drive it fast. So this is the last time I'm going to assault you guys with a wall of text, I promise. But I will be mentioning some of these things, as the talk goes on. But I boiled them down to like 2 main principles. And one is support fast, fun, responsive gameplay. And 2, make it feel like your body is behind the camera. Make it feel physical. Now this is the hard part, because trying to do both of these things at the same time can sometimes seem impossible. But there's where the challenge and the fun comes in, sort of. So let's move on to now that we've talked about design principles and what we want to do and how we want to do it, let's talk about how to make first-person content that feels good. Well, what does feels good mean? Well, first, we've gotten some information already. We want to support first person that supports this fast, fun, and responsive gameplay. And we want to make it feel like there's a body behind the camera, something that feels physical. But like the last piece of information is, don't get in the way of the player's gameplay experience. Don't get in the way of their fun. Your content is not more important than the player's fun. And that's one of the main things to remember about making first-person animation. So this is what Destiny looks like without any first-person animation. And this is the same player presets. Everything is exactly the same, except you're not getting the visual feedback from first person. And it feels like you're just kind of a floating camera inhabiting the world. It doesn't feel like there's any person behind the screen. So we want to change that. We want to start drawing you into our world. So the first thing we need to do before we even start animating is we need a character. So let's just look at Bungie's player character. Now, our player character is actually 2 characters in one. The first one is the third-person player, which you see when your buddies are running around. You see them in the open world, or you see yourself when you do like a super animation. And then we have the first-person player, which is derived from the third-person player, and that's just your arms, a player camera, a support object, and a weapon. And this is the stuff that you're going to actually see from your player view on your screen. Well, when you put these together, you have your actual player character. So you have your first-person arms and rig basically sitting on top of the third-person rig. And we basically make all of the third-person geometry above the waist non-renderable from the first-person camera. And because of that, if you ever wondered, this is what the first-person character, what your player character actually looks like. That's why you can actually see the feet in a Bungie game, because you're actually viewing the third-person animation set. So now we got a character. But where are we going to animate it? We need to understand how to compose art on this kind of canvas, which is your screen, your TV, or your monitor. So let's talk about Bungie's screen space. So this is a view of Destiny's first-person screen, and it looks a lot like a lot of first-person shooters out there. And as you can see, we basically have a really good representation of what's called one-point perspective, and that's basically these disappearing perspective lines all converging on one point in the screen. And that's in most first-person shooters, that's directly in the middle of the screen, but Bungie does something a little bit different, and we have since Halo 2. We're actually lowering the reticle, and by doing that, we're actually giving you this peripheral vision, or vision that you're just kind of aware of in the peripheral of your vision, that actually kind of opens up the world. It makes the world seem larger and more expansive. And for me, even if I look out on you guys, I see this box where I can actually see stuff very clearly. But then there's all this other information on the top and on the sides that I'm aware of, but is not perfectly clear in my vision. So this actually makes it, for me, this makes it feel like it's a little bit more of an immersive, real-life view of how you would be viewing, a world. So we have our screen space, and we kind of know like what it is and how to pose it on there. So let's put a gun on there, and basically like we'll go back to that 1-point perspective again. And this may seem like a very rudimentary thing to suggest, but like taking a little extra time to like actually pay attention to that 1-point perspective and find those disappearing lines and actually line up every single line on your weapon or first-person character so they converge toward that 1-point perspective, it makes it actually feel like, even though like these two things are different, like you have this world that's being rendered and then you have this character that you're looking at, it makes it feel like it's part of that world as opposed to like just window dressing that's sitting on top. And by just taking that little extra step, like it just makes it, you're going to actually build a foundation for your first-person animation that's just going to feel better, more immersive, and right. And I've done a lot of first-person animation where I didn't take this step, and there was always something just kind of missing from it, and this is what it was. So now we're going to start animating in first person. And I thought it'd be interesting to actually show you where this space that you're actually animating in. So this is a representation of first-person animation space. And as you'll see, it's a very small box. It's very distorted by an extreme field of view, and nothing matters outside of that box. Now that sounds actually pretty depressing. But it's actually like, again, where kind of the challenge comes in. So now we've got this gun on screen. We need to start adding something to it to actually give it some life. So let's talk about adding animated overlays to your weapon. So if we just got the gun on the screen, this is what it's going to look like. These are just base animations. So it's a little better than having no first person on there at all, but still it just looks like a piece of geometry sticking out of your screen. It's like, it's not giving me any feeling of physicality or connection to the world. Well, like this is a problem, and I really wanted to solve this for Destiny. And so I kind of went looking for like, where can I get information from our game to actually start plugging back into our first-person animations. And it was really obvious, like this third-person player was actually giving us all the information we really needed. It was giving us pitch, it was giving us yaw, it was giving us this directionality, speed, everything that I might want to like actually bring into first person to actually give it that feeling of physicality to drive these overlay animations. So I made these animations, like these look poses, these jump animation overlays, and these lands. And I started plugging all these animations into the first person. And this is what it looks like again, just base animations only, just kind of the gun just kind of static sticking out of the screen. And now we'll see the base animations with the animated overlays. Now it's starting to feel like a little bit more physical. It's starting to feel reactive, and that's what I want. I want like every time you move that controller around, every time you push that jump button or land, I want you to feel like you're actually in the game, like you're actually behind that camera. I want it to feel physical, and now it's starting to get there. And this by the way, this sounds simple, but like it's one of those things that it just took forever because it's getting all these animations to all work together, sometimes all at once, and blending them off and on. It was just like a really painstaking process. So now we're like about half done. So with like getting the first person character kind of feeling right. But now like we have to start animating things like actions, like reloads and melees and all that stuff. So before we start animating, like I always think about like what's the most important thing in terms of animation, especially in games. And for me, it's like the first thing is posing before anything else. Like the poses have to read, and they have to feel right. So I needed information like in first person, in that first person game space as to how to pose this stuff. Well, we already have some information that we've gotten from the screen space that I talked about earlier. We have this peripheral vision, which is this blue bar. It's on the side and on the top. And basically, you don't want to pose or do any of your player actions or interaction in that space. And the reason is, it's vision that you're aware of, but you're not actually focusing on. If there was something right here, I could actually turn to look at it. But because we're in the first person shooter, like, you don't have the option to do that. So you want to make sure that you don't pose things in that area. The second thing, which is even more important, is this red strip, and I'm calling that the combat corridor. And I call it that because that's where your enemies are going to be coming from, usually like right straight at you, or you're going to be coming at them. You're going to be aiming your gun. And you want to make sure that you don't block that under a lot of most circumstances, just because, well, I'll give you guys an example. Like, how many times have you been playing a first-person shooter, and you're doing pretty well, you go to reload your gun, and all of a sudden you get killed, like, out of nowhere, because you didn't see the guy in front of you because the reload was actually blocking your view. Like, I hate that. Everybody hates that. Your content is actually getting in the way of the player's fun or player's experience. So, what other information can we get from posing? Well, something else that I learned is that the eye travels radially around that reticle, like around that aiming reticle. And that is actually the most important, space on screen, which is to basically, like, it's basically where your eye is always looking. That little circle right there, you're gonna move your camera around, or your player around, so you can view things in that particular space. So, and in that radius. So how do you, like, actually support that radius with your posing? Well, it can be done really overtly, like I did with this warlock melee. Like, the thumb and the forefinger are actually creating kind of like a frame for this radius that we're looking around. And in this way, like, not only can you do like cool actions, but within those actions, you can actually frame like what the player is actually looking at. So you're actually helping them look at this really important part of the screen. And this can be done in less overt ways, like this knife melee, or even this reload. And it's just a way of, like, using your animation to focus the player's attention to where they already really want to look. So that's 2. I like to do 3. So there's one more that I find is really important. So in this grenade throw, and in a lot of our actions, we'll have this moment where you're actually, like, holding a part of the body on the screen just for a moment. Maybe like 7 to 10 frames or something like that. And this is a grenade throw. So if I was actually throwing something in real life, I would be, like, throwing it, and I would barely see my arm, like, come through my field of vision, and then it would go off. Well, because I have this body awareness, my brain has told my body what to do, and I'm aware of where my arm is all the time. Like, I don't need to see it. But in first person, really, the only information that you have about your character, this body behind the screen, is the visual information that we're giving. So that's why we kind of came up with the idea of just kind of, like, keeping that elbow on screen just for a little bit longer, because those poses are what is actually going to read to the player. Like, there's only maybe 3 poses or three frames of animation where it's actually going through the screen. This elbow is actually what's going to read and tell you what you actually just did. So it's difficult to, like, continue to talk about animation without actually going into a real example. So I want to talk about an animation that was really hard for me to get right, and one that ended up being really successful that people ended up liking. So I want to talk about animating the knife melee. So this is like the knife melee that the hunter class in Destiny could use to stab people, like, as a melee. And this is what it looks like. So, how do we do it? Well, again, let's start with poses, and right now let's start with the key poses. And for you non-animators out there, like, key poses are those main poses, or those main pieces of information in an animation that, like, kind of describes the action. So I can get pretty much the entire timing of an action and what that action is going to be by really defining my key poses. So what do we start? Well, this is the idle pose. And we don't want to start here because you actually already have an idle pose on screen. So you don't need to spend like these valuable frames like actually showing it again. Where I would actually start, and where I started with the knife melee was, I started here. And like that pose, that idle pose that I showed you before, that would actually, in my timeline, probably be on like frame -2 or something like that. But this is the first frame of, or starting pose of the animation. There's a lot of information here. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm pulling this gun off screen. I want to have that gun completely off screen by the time by the time I've hit something. And I want to do that because this animation is something that's going to be reused over all weapon sets. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about why we did that later. But the second thing is I'm actually bringing up this knife in a line of action, like to go to the anticipation of the animation. So secondly, it's frame 3, and this is the anticipation pose. Now it used to be that Bungie games, all melees hit on frame 3, and that's just like because you can't. That's how 3 frames is what it takes to really draw a line on screen from like to start from to where you're going. And actually, like it was thought of as like that is law at Bungie. Like that's what you do. Like it's a 3-frame melee. But we were able to kind of push this and push the physicality of this a little bit more. And those 2 frames, we're actually hitting on frame 5. Those 2 frames like actually just gave it a little bit more weight. So. Frame 5, that's the hit pose. So in this frame, like we're actually gonna hit right at the center of the targeting reticle. And by doing this, I'm actually breaking one of my own rules that I just talked to you about, which is blocking that combat corridor. But to really make a melee feel, in first person, really feel effective, it has to actually hit through that reticle and that contact corridor, and it has to almost like stay there just for a little bit just to give people the idea that, or the communication that they actually hit there. Next, the knife melee has a hit and then it has a pull free. So that pull free is going to take about 5 frames, including the overshoot, and then it's a moving hold for about 7 frames. And this is where I was talking to you guys about those poses that we keep on screen to kind of show you that extra bit of physicality, or that you've actually done something. This is that pose, and for me, like I feel like this is one of the most important poses in the animation that you're going to do, because it's probably the pose that people are going to most recognize or see when they're doing the action. And finally, like frame 25, this is where it starts transitioning off screen. And basically, like it's that moving hold to off screen for about 7 frames. And for you animators out here, this is what this animation actually looks like on the timeline. So let's take a look at that all blocked out. Now it looks pretty. It doesn't look great right now, but I've actually got all the information that I need to like start building this into an animation that feels good in gameplay and also like kind of feels right physically. So that's the polished version of this animation. So there's one more piece to this. One more thing that's going to actually kind of up your game and kind of make this animation feel a little bit more physical and a little bit more immersive, and that's the player camera. And the camera is one of those things that can actually be really cool. It can kind of add that extra bit of physicality, or it can be really destructive to your game. And like I don't know if a lot of you have played games that have made you motion sick, or you get motion sick, but like it's one of the reasons why you really have to be careful with camera animation, because even if your camera motion is going to make only 10% of the population sick, like if you're selling 1 million copies of your game, well, you've just lost 100,000 people that will put your game down, never play it again, and probably never play one of your sequels. So it's definitely something that you have to pay attention to. Now this next clip I'm going to show you, if you guys have any, if you have any motion sickness, you might want to look away. But basically, this is just a head-mounted camera, a GoPro on a guy's head, just running straight down a track, running in a straight line. So this is actually where I started when I was kind of trying to figure out what the camera, or what the eyes were doing, what the camera was doing. And I was like, oh, okay, I'll just animate that. But I actually tried. I walk around like all the time with this GoPro camera and try and figure out what things look like from a first-person view. And I quickly realized that that's not actually how you see the world. It's not right. And it's because we have, as human beings, an image stabilization system. Like a lot of you probably know technology with cameras, these new cameras that have image stabilization. Well, we have like a biological version, and that's called the vestibular system. And feel free to correct me. I'm not a doctor, so if I've gotten it wrong, you can tell me after the talk. But the vestibular system has two parts. And one is the vestibular ocular reflex. Now, this is basically a fancy way to basically say, like, if I'm looking at you guys out here, and I turn my head, my eyes are going to turn in the opposite direction of that turn to like keep my eyes focused on what I want to look at. And this happens very fast, like it happens almost immediately, to like stabilize an image that you're trying to look at. But your eye actually gets that information from the inner ear. So the inner ear is like kind of an accelerometer. It actually, like as you move around and tilt around, it actually tells your eye and your brain like what's actually happening. So as I move around, like it allows my eye to keep up and continue to look at that thing that's interesting to me that I'm looking at. And like it can be if you look at this picture right here of Floyd Mayweather, like it's a really good example. He's doing, and especially since we're talking about melees, like he's punching this guy, and it's a really violent action, but his eyes are keeping up with the turn of his head and body, and he's continuing to look at his target, which is exactly where his glove is hitting. So, like a really simple way of thinking about this stuff is balance equals alignment, and that's like that feeling. It's basically like the balance of seeing motion and feeling motion. If those things are in alignment, then you're healthy. That's it. It feels right, and you feel in alignment. But if you feel emotion and don't see it, or if you see emotion and don't feel it, you're going to get motion sickness. And a lot of you have probably felt that. Like if you've ever been sitting in the back seat of a car and you're reading, a lot of you might have felt like that motion sickness, and that's because your body is feeling the motion of the car, but you're not actually. You don't have any visual reference of that. So your eyes and your inner ear are actually out of balance there. And it's the same. It's the inverse with games. Like if you're seeing a lot of motion on screen, but your body's not feeling it, then it's also going to cause that motion sickness. So a good way to like what do I do with that? Like I know that now. So I know that a lot of motion on camera or the wrong motion on camera is going to make me sick. So I kind of wanted to see like what motion was right. So if you rotate a camera, and I'm not talking about like if you're rotating your head, but if you actually rotate a camera around, it's going to create these large motions in the world and on the horizon line, and especially on objects far away. And especially like camera roll in that way can be very disorienting. It's like a lot of motion, especially when you're talking about making motion for the motion on top. On the player camera in like an open world. So camera translation is actually kind of the opposite. It creates like large motions up close, and then it kind of like trails off as it goes off into the distance. So if you're looking at something up close, like a player or an NPC or a combatant or just anything, you're going to see that large motion, but then in the world it's going to kind of trail off after a little bit, or it seems to. So I kind of decided that in making camera animation for these melees, that I wanted to do it like with mostly translation. And We did do a little bit of like rotation on the camera to kind of mimic what was happening up close with that translation, and kind of so we could see a little bit of movement in the distance. But then, because of some game optimization that we did kind of at the end of the project, like those small decimals of numbers got stripped out. So wah wah, next game. So I know I want to use translation, but like I want more information of how to use this translation. So in most actions, in most violent actions like that, that have intent, like the head leads the action. And that can actually be seen on the slow motion of this boxer hitting this guy. So if we really slow this down, this is pretty cool. Like when the boxer's setting up, he's actually setting up like with his anticipation. So as he sets up here, like his head's going to kind of go to the left and actually anticipate with it. Then as he starts to throw it, his head's actually going to lead that action or that hit. It's going to lead his arm. And then as the boxer is about to make contact with his target, and it's about to cross the center line of his body, the head actually starts to kind of reverse that direction and go in the opposite way. So, and this is just because like his body's trying to keep on balance, and so it's just kind of like his head's moving, then his arm, and then his head kind of starts to go in the other direction. And then finally, like as that head goes in the other direction, it kind of like boof, like does a little shake to kind of get back over the center of the body and maintain that center of mass so he doesn't fall over. So like a lot of times like this happens really like imperceptibly, and you don't see it unless you look really close. And I had this really cool like video of Mike Tyson doing this, and it was totally apparent, but it was like VHS quality, so I didn't figure you guys would want to see that. So here it is one more time. So now I'm going to show you like the camera path that I kind of created with that same principle on that knife melee. Oh. So here's the slow motion version of that. And as you can see, like the player camera is going to actually lead the action, into that hit, and then slightly lead the action on the pullout. And it might just be like by one frame, but it really makes a difference. And as you can see there, like basically I'm creating like a grid inside Maya within the first-person view. And I'm doing that because I want to just see what's happening in my first-person view while I, do my camera animation. And secondly, I actually showed you guys like the finished animation of the knife melee first, and that's because I actually want to finish that animation and finish those arcs before I even start getting into the player camera. And that's because I just want to concentrate on one thing at a time, and I don't want the player camera animation to actually be destructive to the animation itself. And I just do that by basically finishing the animation and then putting all of the player control flags in camera space. So as I move that camera around, like the animation isn't affected. And then at the very end, I can start making slight like offsets to the camera and the character. So from first person, this is what my final camera animation looks like. And I'm not going crazy with it. It's just enough to like make you feel like that head is leading the action and the body. You feel that physicality of the knife hitting and then getting pulled out, and then that motion trailing off. So let's see like this motion kind of through the development. And finally, with camera animation. All right, so that was like a good representation of kind of how we developed like a motion for first person, like for Destiny. But like the final piece of this is How do you keep from killing yourself in the process? So why is there a plate of delicious waffles on the screen? Well, there's actually a story behind this. When I was working on a previous title, Halo Reach, I had a producer come to me and say, yeah, so we've got this beta build at 6 o'clock in the morning that we're cutting, and the designers want to change the timing of the grenade throw. I was like, okay. And he's like, so you need to do that before this date, before 6 o'clock in the morning. And I was like, okay, well, it's 7 o'clock at night. I guess I can do that. But unfortunately, like in this game that we're making, each gun had its own unique grenade throw. So it was like 22 guns in this thing. So then there was like 3 different grenade throws on the third-person character. So I had to like change like 25 animations like before this date, before this cutoff time of 6 a.m. where we're going to send this beta in. And like for some reason, like he said, you know what? I'm gonna make you a plate of waffles if you do this for me. And for some reason, like I thought that was a really good trade-off. And but really, the point of the whole story is the waffles are not worth it. The waffles are not worth it. So this like really affected me because it was a really painful experience. And so I wanted to figure out as we like move forward into this, building this new IP, like how I could figure out like not to do this anymore, or not to have this happen to anybody else. So there's 3 really cool things we came up with. The first one is called an agnostic animation. This is basically just a non-weapon specific animation. And these are animations that we shared over all weapon sets. And so basically, like the point is, like we made this animation, we authored it on the rifle pose, and then basically like put the hand in kind of a neutral pose. The gun went off screen. You do the grenade throw, and then we use the ready animation to bring the weapon back up, back so it can fire again. So just going to illustrate that, here's the rocket launcher animation set. And there was a grenade throw. That kind of popped a little bit. Oh well. But basically, like that grenade throw was like used on everything. It was used for the pistol, whether you're holding the pistol, a rifle, a machine gun, or a rocket launcher. And by doing that, like if a designer came to me then, he said, yeah, I want you to change this animation, and you've got this crazy deadline. I'm like, sure, it's 1 animation. So instead of 25, which was great. So this is basically how it looked with the whole thing together. Oh well, I guess you don't get to see that. Sorry. Here it is. And it actually worked. It blended pretty smoothly. And I actually wasn't sure about that because I wanted to actually get that kind of opposing action where you would see that throw and you would see kind of that pull of the arm. So I was really concerned that by not doing that, we would kind of lose a little bit of physicality. But it worked. Like and nobody complained. So it didn't get in the way of the player experience. So it was actually successful. And it kept me from many sleepless nights. So. The second one was animation scaling. Now, a lot of you animators out there, I'm sure, like you feel passionate about your work. Like you spend a lot of time on an animation. You want it to be presented well. Well, like we didn't have the budget to like just make animations at different speed. Like we needed to not only we were not only under a time crunch, but we just didn't have the memory to make all these different reloads. So I made one reload, and they're like, yeah, we're gonna scale this up to like, I don't know, 150%. I was like, no, that's my beautiful reload animation. Don't do it. Don't touch it. They're like, it'll be fine. I was like, oh my God, this is gonna be terrible. But you know what? It was actually fine. Like, people actually liked it. They liked feeling that perk of seeing an animation that actually, happens a little bit faster. It actually like added to their visceral and visceral experience of the game and something they enjoyed. And I mean, let's face it, a reload animation is a punishment given to you by a designer. It's like you fired your gun too many times. You have to stop and reload this thing and wait until you can fire again. So, like, yeah, as an animator, your whole job is to basically like make that as seamless and palatable as possible by like making this pretty animation. Well, the actual act of speeding up that animation ended up making it something that was even better and more palatable. Now, this next one is something that may seem boring to you, but it was really exciting for me. So I actually got brought into Bungie as a contractor because the designers were going to change the FOV of the game. And FOV is short for field of view. So if you have like a high field of view, like in the 70s or something like that, that means you have a wider aperture that you're actually being able to see the game. And that's good for first-person shooters because you want to be able to see as much as possible while you're actually, of what's happening around you. A smaller number means a narrower field of view. So they were adjusting this slightly. But even a small adjustment to field of view can actually start to affect what's happening with your first-person content. Like they changed it a little bit, and you can start seeing inside of meshes, or things start to seem like they're getting smaller and seem a little bit weaker. So they brought me in because they were changing it, and they wanted me to basically reposition all the animations so they look good again. Well, I knew that if they did that, like when we were trying to make this giant new IP, that it would be really painful because their designers are always messing around with stuff and making artists' lives miserable. No, I'm just kidding. No, they need to be able to iterate and change things as much as we do as artists. So we did something that was actually pretty cool. So the world camera FOV was 72, and the designers kind of were changing that back and forth like through the entire development of Destiny. But the FP arms and weapon FOV was 77, and that remained locked from the beginning of the project until the end. Because we figured out exactly where we wanted to frame that weapon and where it looked the best. And then we didn't want to change that. So by doing this, by actually splitting up the FOV between these two elements, we were able to keep moving forward with what we wanted to do, as opposed to like doing all this busy work of readjusting our content based on experiments by design. And also, alternately, design was able to do this without being destructive to our work. So it was actually an incredible time-saving thing that we did. So, like, besides the obvious, like, what do we get by not killing ourselves? Obviously, we don't kill ourselves, but we get time. And as game developers, we're constantly fighting against the clock, trying to make our deadlines. But as artists, like, what you really need as an artist to make something good is you need time for experimentation and iteration. And that's how you make a good product. And that's what artists are really there for. Like that's how to effectively use an artist, is actually give them time to do this. So if you can actually plan for things that are going to help this within your pre-production and production process, it's actually going to help your end product make something that people are really going to respond to, because the artist has had time to really polish it and make it as good as possible. So what do we talk about today? Like, we talked about a lot of stuff. We talked about design principles. We talked about the idle and the overlay animations, posing in first person. Talked about animating the knife, the camera, and finally how to keep from killing yourself. But like, really the main takeaway from this talk is that details matter, and it's worth waiting to get it right. Now, this was a quote from Steve Jobs that really resonated with me, because like first-person animation is something that you just see constantly in front of you all the time, and like no matter like what your schedule says, like if you want your game to feel good, like this is one element that you have to spend time on. And I would say like that to lots of different disciplines within games. Details do matter. It's worth researching. It's worth spending a little time to experiment and iterate on your content and make it feel as good as possible. Do we have sound? And finally, like this is what we got like by doing that, by kind of focusing on those details. No sound. So there's a lot of cool music. Oh. Oh, well, it's too late. No worries. No worries. I promise you, it's much better with the music. So this is a lot of the first-person animation that we ended up with in Destiny. So thank you very much. I really wanted to, I'm thankful that you guys came to hear my talk. I really wanted to give this because, like, even for me, like this stuff really isn't taught anywhere, and I wanted to like, and unless you're like part of a studio that actually like has a tradition of doing this type of animation, it's really hard to learn. So I hope you guys got something out of it. And I'll take questions now if you guys like.
So you did the melee for the hunter. Did you also do the throwing knife animation?
Yeah.
Can you talk about how you made this thin little projectile feel like something physical? Like I throw it and I feel that thud when it connects. That's magic. Thank you. So
yeah, I can definitely talk about that. Basically, like I mean, everything kind of comes from life. So I would spend a lot of time like kind of trying to do that motion, seeing what it would feel like, and also seeing what it would look like from my vision. And so I would kind of start there, you know what I mean? And obviously that timing is something that wouldn't work in game, but it like gave me some reference to how to actually do it. And then it was basically like working with the designer to, you know, define that timing in a way that would actually continue to still feel good to the player. And finally, like I would animate that knife like leaving the hand and actually like spinning and traveling through space. And then when I was working with the designer on this, he actually took that path or that rotation, and actually the knife itself, like as you release it, that's just a prop object. So that prop actually, we disappear that prop, and then that becomes an in-game object that actually, or a projectile that goes toward the target. And by just kind of balancing like the timing and the posing and physicality of that with like kind of working with the designer to get that to feel as good as possible, like that's kind of how we did it. And I think it's all about like kind of that one of those first principles I talked about, which is to like work together, like with other disciplines to make it feel good. You know what I mean? And like you can't do it in a vacuum. It has to be like kind of a team effort. So does that answer your question?
Did you actually apply, like did the designer apply any like dynamic positioning for the rotation, like to make it feel like it's always gonna hit like first or anything, just to try and clutch it?
I guess the question is like, did the designer add any dynamic rotation to the knife to kind of make it feel right? And to be honest, like I'm not exactly sure. Like, you know, and like there are certain points when you just like when you work together and then there are certain points where you hand off to somebody with a different skill set and they kind of push it that extra mile. So that was Danny Bulla. He did a great job helping get that one finished. So yeah, thank you.
Hey, I had a couple quick questions about the knife melee. The one you started it like the first frame was already up and ready. Where was the knife on the frame before? Is the knife always present on the first person mesh?
On actually we like spawn that knife like on the first frame.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, and I tried a bunch of different stuff. Like I was like, well, maybe we can use blending to make like kind of a smoother transition, or maybe, you know, like I want to start the handoff screen so it would be a little bit more believable. But what I really found was like it's such a violent action that like bringing that knife, like popping that knife up on screen, like it wasn't something that people like could read like visibly. It just like, oh, you know, what actually read was the idea of that arc, because it's only 5 frames from the, you know, point of the beginning of the animation to the hit. So you have like an incredibly short amount of time, and your eye actually can't usually track motion that fast. So it was just like boom, and you know, people believed it. So it was good, and that took a lot of experimentation. I wasn't sure what was going to work. So
the second thing was just probably real quick. That you stabbed and you actually held it for 5 frames. I see that there's a big effect hiding the contact. Is that all there is, or is the enemy actually playing a reaction to anchor them to that stab?
All the enemies play like actual reactions to the stab, as well as like effects, you know, making it feel like it's impactful and like it's like adding to that physicality.
But it's not pinned, right? It's not actually like.
No,
Okay.
not exactly. No, and basically, like you have a cone of effect, you know, going away from the character, and I was actually really worried about that one because you're actually hitting this point, but it actually worked because because it starts up at the ear right here, as you come through it, like this arm actually kind of takes up that whole cone, so when it hits, it actually feels right, and there's actually some adjustment of the player where the player will actually kind of suck to the combatant a little bit, if you're actually on target when you activate the knife melee.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So 2 questions. One, in terms of the animation for first person and third person, are those the same animations, or do they go through some adjustments? And the second question is just scheduling. So how long did you have per animation?
Per animation?
Yeah, like the melee. How long did you have to work on that? Like,
Oh, okay.
A day, a year? You know.
Yeah. The animations on the third-person player were like also like we thought of them as chunks. Like the first-person reload and the third-person reload were basically an assignment handed out to one person. So like when I got this knife stab, like I was responsible for the third-person knife stab too, and like they're actually separate animations. So we try to make sure that the timing is exactly the same on those, on usually like on all those key pose elements, but they're separate. And like we usually do, like I think like a first person animations take a little bit longer to do. Like I would say, you know, that knife stab on the third person character, which was basically like from the waist up, because it's a replacement animation on top of like a navigation set or an idle. That would take maybe like a day. Like a first-person animation like that, just to get it right, and because you know you're going back and forth with designers and you're putting it in play tests, like I would say something like that, like altogether might take, you know, like a week to get right, or even longer. You know, like there are times when like those animations just kept coming back. It's like, wow, 1 frame less. 1 frame more. I was like, oh God. So yeah, it's kind of, I would say like, yeah, it takes a week, but it's really like, who knows? You know what I mean? It's like, I would say like it takes as long as it takes to get right. So, and producers don't like to hear that, yeah. But that's kind of the truth. So, awesome. Thank you.
Hi, my question is about the FOVs. I noticed you use 2 different FOVs for the first-person weapon, hands, and world. Mm-hmm. My worry is that if you have some animation like maybe a little bit longer melee attack animation, because the enemy and the weapons are rendered in 2 different FOVs, their position on screen might be a bit off. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with this problem, or you feel it doesn't matter at all?
I mean, it definitely does matter, and there is that problem. We were able to kind of like, I think when designers brought it down to 72, the world FOV, like we were definitely like looking at how that FOV was affecting the combatants and other players. Like when you actually were to see melees or up close attacks, like how that would actually affect the combat. And I feel like they kind of they hit that threshold of like, okay, we can't go anymore, otherwise it's going to start to break down. So it was basically just kind of like look at it and see if it was believable, and then you know, do that. There wasn't as much science to it as you might think. It was just like, that looks right. Okay, cool. Let's move on.
So it's mostly like experimenting for the just right FOV angle.
Yeah, definitely. And like that's like most of it is just kind of seeing what looks right, seeing what feels right, and then just doing that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey. I had a question to ask about the animation blending stuff. For you know, so in the overlay animations, you were talking about like first-person like blending animations for like, you know, the movement stuff. So could you describe a little of like how easy it was for you to kind of preview those blends, like, you know, adjusting them? Like, did you have control over them, basically?
Over those animations and how they blended, or
yeah, that kind of stuff.
I mean, I had some control based on like kind of some blending numbers that we were able to apply to specific animations. But yeah, you know, it basically was kind of like, you know, okay, you know, these two animations don't play well together, so I'll have to blend this one off while this one blends on, you know, at a certain point.
Oh, but at least you had like full control. It wasn't like a designer had to do it or anything.
Yeah. The designers are basically like, well, you just make it feel right, you know. And so, yeah, I would just sit at my desk, you know, constantly like looking at, you know, looking at the look screens and looking at the, you know, jumps and being like, okay, that's a little bit off, or that's not playing well with this particular overlay, and, you know, just make slight adjustments to the animation or the blend or the ramping on and off of the animations. So.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I just had a quick question. When animating the first person player inside that camera frustrum with all the weird perspective and all that going on, are there any tips or kind of techniques you used as far as preventing, you know, the mesh penetration and clipping planes and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I basically kind of, like, I mean, I use that kind of combat corridor and peripheral vision thing, and basically, like, I try and stay in those safe zones from the standpoint of that planar view, and then from, like, the standpoint of, like, how the depth of that area, I just kind of try and keep in mind that when I'm doing an action or putting anything on screen in first person, that the farther away I get an element away from the camera, the smaller it's going to be. And when you get an element farther away from the camera and it gets smaller, it feels weaker. And then if it gets closer, in fact, when it gets too close, then it starts to feel claustrophobic. So just trying to, like, kind of find the find it within there, or find the best kind of depth is really important. And I'd say, like, that's kind of the guide that I use.
So you used a combination of kind of exaggerated poses and kind of more close poses in order to kind of tweak the scale of the objects with the animation?
Yeah, I mean, and it's not like me like saying, oh yeah, you know, you should do it this way. And in fact, all this stuff, it's like this is what I tried and what seemed to work, you know. And even like the camera rotation, it's like, well, yeah, just be aware of like what that does. I'm not saying not to do it, but yeah, it's basically just kind of experimentation. And first person, you know, if you interview first person animators are still left out there, I mean, you know, it's just all kind of about feel. Like you put something in there, you experiment with it, and sometimes it feels right, and sometimes it feels right in Maya or in 3D Studio Max, and then you get it in game and it just completely falls apart. And I'm not even sure why sometimes, but that seems to be kind of the way. So it's just basically, I'd say, just develop a workflow that where you're continually getting content in game and actually testing it in game. That's the best way to go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So that grenade thing kind of sounded like a nightmare when you came up on the...
What's that?
The refactoring all the grenade animation sounded like a nightmare. So I was wondering if you could have maybe separated the two arms on different tracks. So you could have just done the throw on different timing and then give that to the designers like as they wanted it, and then spend more time to get what you actually wanted on like the right hand with the weapons. Is something like that, do you think is possible?
Yeah, in fact, I was actually, like, I really wanted to do that. I wanted to, like, actually separate the rig. So like I could do something on the left hand and do something else on the right hand, or and kind of mix and match and put those together. That would have like saved a lot of time and effort. But it also required a lot of engineering work and a lot of work that was outside my department. And it's just one of those things that we just didn't get to, or we didn't get to early enough in the development process to actually make it effective. But I mean, yeah, it's a brilliant idea, and we definitely want to try stuff like that in the future. So.
Well, the agnostic idea seemed like a good solution as well. It seemed to be cool to blend those two. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, like I said, I wasn't sure if it was going to work, and
yeah, it's great.
Yeah,
thanks.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, thank you very much for coming. I'll be around for a little bit if any of you guys want to ask me any more questions. Thank you.